Mastering is the last step of your song before you ship it to the world. And you can often break your song if you end up overdoing your master, which I see a lot of producers doing. Therefore, here are the most common issues that I see producers making when mastering their songs, and more importantly, how you can solve them. Let's go down to Ableton and let's get started with this tutorial, shall we? Let's go. So we're here in Ableton and we're gonna start this with the first thing that I see a lot of producers doing wrong in the mastering, which is essentially clipping the mix. Listen to this song over here. You can see that the mix is drastically clipping, and because we needed to push the levels of these songs to something that matches our reference track, essentially the low end started to clip. And that is essentially one of the biggest issues in terms of mixing and mastering. The low end has a bit too much power. But how can you solve this? Well, if you have only the master chain, what you can do is just adjust the master chain with some EQ. But if you have your mixing over there, you can just go directly in the mix and adjust directly the mix. For this, you're gonna use a spectrum. And in the spectrum, what you can do is you can listen how loud your track is and listen how loud the reference track is. But you can see that the kick over here is playing at -12 in the reference track, and in our track at around -5 dB, so that is really loud. So again, we're gonna go into the master file, but again, if you have the mixing, adjust the mixing. We're just gonna introduce an EQ, and we're gonna do a really big adjustment over here. And you can see that this adjustment alone already solved a little bit of the clipping. Without it, with it. Just this one adjustment solved the issue of the clipping. If that doesn't solve you the clipping, that might be something in the settings with your sidechain, so check it out also, and you can see this in the video over here in the top right corner. But let's move on to the second thing, which is sometimes it's unbalanced in the non-bass regions as well. Sometimes you're doing the break, and that's a moment where you feel that it's not as loud as the drop, but even then, sometimes it's clipping. And that happens because sometimes you have an issue with your mixing that it's unbalanced, or sometimes it's even your mastering chain that needs some adjustment. For example, let's listen to this over here. You can see that there's a lot of crackling in the sound, and I've seen some really big songs being released with these kind of crackles in the sound. This crackling is distortion, and this is not good for you. You have to solve this, and there are two ways that you can solve this. Again, if you can't solve it in the mix, go to the mix directly because it's going to be more intricate. But we're going to just take a little bit of the mids because that's essentially being overdone in this song. And you can see that doing this EQ adjustment solves the issue of the crackling because the mixing was overdone. However, that might change the tonal balance control of the song, because listen to this, how it was before and how it is now. All the good stuff went away. So how can you solve this? Well, essentially, sometimes the issue is in your mastering chain. For example, if we go to the master over here, this is the ozone maximizer that I'm using. But listen to what happens when I only change this setting over here. You can see that the crackling is gone and the tonal balance of the song is kept, which is a good thing. So sometimes the issue is not even on your mixing, sometimes the issue is on your mastering chain. And that's why it's really important for you to understand every single piece of your mastering chain really well. So this way, if any issue happens, you know how to solve it without having to interfere in your mixing. Now let's go to the third issue, which is essentially you're overdoing your mixing during your mastering. One of the most common issues that I see producers doing is they use their mastering chain to help them in their mixing. And this is a bit wrong because you should do the mixing in the mixing and not in the mastering chain. For example, in a recent mix that I've done for a client, I've seen him doing something like this to his master chain. It had like a 6 dB boost on the high end, and essentially when you turned it off, the song sounded without that much high end, and essentially I had to push a lot in the mixing to compensate that high end boost that he did in the master chain. What is the problem with doing this in the master chain? Essentially, you're going to be pushing frequencies that you shouldn't be pushing in the mixing, but since you're doing the master chain, you're pushing everything. And with this, you might be pushing stuff that you don't want really to push. For example, if you do the same kind of adjustment in the low end, that can cause you a really big problem of having your kick or your bass sounding a little bit overdone. But how can you solve this? Essentially, if you have an adjustment like this of 7 dB in your master, go in your mixing and try to adjust these to the elements that need to be boosted, and only to them. You don't need to boost everything because not everything needs to be boosted. Do it in your mixing and avoid doing it in your master because you're going to have a way better result this way. Now let's go to the fourth issue, which is sometimes you have a master that ends up being too wide, and that can be a really big problem. When your master is too wide, the main problem is that sometimes the mono signal can sound weak. And when the mono signal can sound weak, essentially the translation of your master from good speakers to bad speakers can end up sounding crappy. For example, if you listen to the song on stuff like this, like JBL speakers, you have a mix that sounds amazing on amazing speakers and sounds terrible on bad speakers. And that's definitely something that you don't want. For example, listen to this mix and listen to the original version of it. Now listen to the wider version of it, and it's really subtle. You can see that the mix spreads out a little bit, and the problem is that, listen to this in mono. And now to the wide version. Non-wide. Wide. It's a really slight difference in this scenario, but it can be way bigger depending on your song. And the problem is if your mono sounds weak, essentially your song can end up sounding weak on crappy speakers as well. So how can you solve this? Essentially, a way that I have for this is if you have an element that is a core element and you put the song in mono and it disappears from your ears, it has to be more in mono. The second thing that you can do also is use plugins like Ozone Imager and listen to this correlation meter over here. Listen to the original version. Listen to the super wide version now. Can you see how the super wide version goes below 0? When the correlation meter goes below 0, that not necessarily means that you have an issue for sure, but it might mean that you need to look your mix a little bit more. So if your meter is hitting below 0, definitely check it out because it might be a little bit too wide. Or if you feel that it's a bit too wide, definitely make the elements a little bit more mono. And you can do this just essentially by duplicating the elements that are too stereo, making them mono and making them a little bit louder to make the sounds a little bit more mono as well. Now let's go to the fifth issue over here, which is essentially not using reference tracks. In this tutorial, for example, we've talked about the sounds being too wide, maybe have a bit too much bass, maybe have a bit too much mids, but compared to what? Not only this, but how loud should you put your master? So that's why you need to use reference tracks because they help you understand if you have too much bass, if you have too much mids, if your songs are too wide, and not only this, but how loud should you leave your tracks on as well. For example, listen to our reference track and listen to our track. Supposedly they are the same loudness, but if we wanted to make the song as loud as this one, we'd probably have to make some adjustments in the master chain or in our mix to make the song wider as well. But again, that's just something that we wouldn't have known if we didn't use reference tracks. And not only this, but how wide is too wide? It depends on your reference track. It depends on the labels that you want to send your song to. So that's why I recommend whenever you're working on your master, make sure to use reference tracks. There are good examples of what you want to achieve with it. Now let's go to the last problem, which is essentially when the master is too compressed and essentially ends up crushing the sound. The biggest problem with having your master chain overcompressed is that it can sound less dynamic, and not only this, but it can sound less controlled in terms of loudness as well, which is essentially what you want to control when you're trying to overcompress the song. Check, for example, how it looks like when you have your master overcompressed. This is the overcompressed version, and this is the compression, which is okay. You have a lot more peaks, but not only this, but you have dips that are less dynamic as well. And that ends up making a song less interesting because it's just a big sausage of sound. And lastly, as I told you, and this is to me the biggest problem and the easiest way to detect if you're overcompressing your mix, listen to how it sounds when you overcompress your mix. Listen especially to this moment over here. This is the okay version, but listen to the overcompressed version. When you take out the kick, essentially it's going to open up space in your mix. And because it's open up space in your mix, the compression will push everything louder. And by pushing everything louder, the moments that you don't have kick are going to be slightly louder than the moments that you have kick. And that's a big problem because essentially you're making your song less controlled in terms of loudness. And that's essentially what you want to solve with this. The easiest way to solve this for mastering especially is whenever you're doing compression in your master, the recommended is to use a slow attack, a fast release, and a threshold that does 2 dB of compression as this one is doing. That is not only me who is saying. I recently saw a video from a mixing engineer called Streaky that you can see also here on YouTube, and he mentioned the exact same thing. Slow attack, fast release, and 2 dB of compression, and that's enough for your mastering chain. Sometimes I go a little bit beyond. I go around 4 dB of compression, but that's about it, and that's as much compression as what I would do in the song. And that's it. I hope you liked the video, and I hope to see you soon in the next Abstrakt video next week. Ciao.